What's up everyone? Alex Corey here up at the farm with KC Gardens. Today we're going over the same questions I've already answered on this channel, but I've had a number of people come in just to chat with me when I'm at LOTUS, and I have a couple of micros growing there, about 4 trays just for experimentation and show and tell, as it were. And everyone seems to have the same questions and wants a one-size-fits-all answer. So we're going over the problems with a one-size-fits-all answer in this video coming up. So one of the major issues that we run into is seeding densities and humidity. And I've done a video on this before with environmental controls. But basically the person who came in was just doing a shelving unit in a grow tent, which is amazing. So that would just be one of these. So we have these short of half stacks, so we're not doing 4 trays per, just to see if it does anything for the available photosynthesizing area for the leaves. This is our first good batch of sunflower, and it's happened because we had a summer-like week in Asheville. And even if you have temperature control, so even if you've got heaters and everything lined up, full room humidifiers and dehumidifiers, your outside ambient temperature will always affect the growth cycles of the extremely sensitive crops like basil, like sunflower, things that are just a little more touchy that really like high humidity and warmth, think summer. So this crop is fantastic, thankfully, for sunflower. It's got another day to go and the rest of those holes will pop off, but the taste is pretty phenomenal, and it's at the exact right time. Yeah, it was pretty good. So the questions were basically someone was going way overboard with their shelf. They had a grow tent, they had a humidifier. They're not growing for production yet, they're just playing around. It's basically an expensive hobby. They had 4 LEDs per shelf, and they just wanted to see what it did to coverage. I'm curious because I already did an experiment back at my old house. Video will be here about the difference between 1 LED and 2, or 1 fluorescent and 2, or 1 LED and 1 fluorescent, and there was no significant difference in yield. You might be getting an extra ounce or 2 out of the heavier crops, so maybe a sunflower or a pea or something like that, but most of them grow fast enough where it doesn't matter, and the light is literally just to trigger certain growth processes in the plant. So it has almost nothing to do with the amount of photons and photosynthesizing capability of the different light wavelengths so much as they are present. And people find this with hemp as well. Work with a lot of hemp growers, and whenever they're flipping schedules, people get very, very anal about things. And the experienced growers tend to try to simplify things because growing things is complex enough because you have to manage microorganisms and environment, ecosystems, and all of that. So the name of the game with something that can be simplified is to simplify it as much as you can, and then work with complexity in the very few variables that you have, such as soil or seed. I mean, those are plenty complex. So humidity is plenty complex, all things. Simplify it as much as you can. This guy was using 4 commercial LEDs per shelf, and I was like, that's overkill. There's no real difference between 1 or 2. There will certainly be no difference between, well, I should say, there might be a difference between 1 and 4, but I don't know that it's going to be worth the extra electricity costs, and then you have to worry about replacing that many more lights. So definitely experiment with it, but if you can get away with 2, and 2 is the standard for all commercial microgreen growers, that's, Curtis Stone, Micro YYC, any of the companies that have been featured on any of the prominent microgreen channels all use 2, usually fluorescents because they do crank out heat and they have the most spread, but LEDs work just as well for things that don't care, like sunflowers look just fine and they're under LEDs, so they don't really care as long as the ambient temperature is fine. And these things all like it. So we got some red pak choi over here. These guys love the ambient temperature. We tried experimenting with a non-cocoa, and this was one of the other points. That guy didn't work well because we tried doing a peat mix. You can do any growing media you like. You just have to be consistent with it and know that protocols and procedures for one media, like cocoa, will be completely different for peat-based or for burlap or hydro or any of that. They all work the same way. The seed obviously doesn't change, but you can get away with, you know, watering once every other day for cocoa, which is what we do. We got some shiso here. But if you do peat, you have to water every day most likely, especially if you don't have super high humidity. So the plant is just pulling the moisture out of the soil. So the point of this whole video is it's extremely context dependent. We were chatting about seed densities in the shop the other day, mostly because he was wondering, basically he was just putting the buggy before, or the cart before the horse before the cart before the horse. I always mix that one up. Trying to do too many things before he even had reliable generations of cycles. So what I always tell people starting is pick a medium. It doesn't matter. You can do a peat-based pro mix with perlite and an inoculant. You can do cocoa. You can do straight cocoa. You can do a potting mix. People tend to do a good amount of research. I mean, you should know what you're getting yourself into, but people tend to do too many things at once before they get a good foundation. So what I told them and what I tell everyone is pick any medium. Just, you know, make it cheap because you don't need anything. He was also under the impression that you needed nutrition. You don't. You can grow in straight coconut coir, which has zero fertilizer. None of the crops that you grow, unless you're growing a long-term amaranth or maybe some of the herbs that are pushing 3 weeks, need any real fertilizer. Compost is a different story. A lot of growers will mix compost in with their base media, like with a Pro Mix or with a cocoa, because the microbes and the various micronutrients do affect color, antioxidant, and moisture retention. So those things are variable. Whenever you start thinking about maximizing or optimizing, you're talking about 5 to 10%. And what I told him was, it's a difference. If you're growing for yourself just for an experiment, you will not see any noticeable difference. But if you're keeping track and you have to meet a day-specific deadline every week, and then you start messing with variables, that's where you start seeing changes from a day or 2 days. So your crop might be ready a day early. Let's give you some Ruby Streak mustard. I absolutely love mustard. Might be one of my favorite crops. Your results are going to be based off of your context entirely. So if it doesn't matter, don't put as much thought into it. So stick with a single media. It doesn't have to be complex. If you want to jump the gun, go ahead and mix some compost into it. Do like a compost is usually the same price per cubic foot as potting soil or as cocoa, maybe a little more. So maybe do like a third compost or a quarter compost and the rest your usual media, just to see what it does to flavor, stem girth, weight. And if you can get a little weight, obviously an ounce or two extra per tray will matter if you're on a commercial scale, and those will add up. But if you're just doing it by yourself and your harvesting methods aren't precise, you won't ever see that ounce. It won't really matter. So focus on the fundamentals. Pick one media. Humidity should be probably higher than 30%, which is what he was at, and that was part of the issue. You can do it 30%. Things will just take a day longer, and you might have to worry about immediately watering once you uncover a stack of trays, like these guys. So These are all look like broccoli. You're going to have a ton of broccoli. So once you uncover these, they're going to be a little dry, especially if they're next to a heater. And we got some cabbage germinating behind them. I still have been only able to go up to five per, and I still put mustards on top of broccolis and cabbages. But these guys are booming because they appreciate the extra humidity and warmth. Everything really likes 65, 70, 75 with like 50 to 60% humidity. Perfect for everything. Sunflower likes even a little more. But I'm just rambling at this point. Point being, don't get overcomplicated before you have a foundational process and you can reproduce the same crops every week on a schedule. If you're thinking about selling them, if you're just thinking about growing for a hobby for yourself, yeah, none of this matters, but it's supposed to be low tech when you start. So 2 lights, LEDs are great if you're not growing any of the hot crops. As you can see, it really doesn't matter for things that are hot. So for sunflower or summer crops, basil, it still doesn't matter. Like the shiso is a summer crop, and this is under a single LED. See that? Single LED. Shiso doesn't care. So you might get an extra couple days out of it when you're talking over 3 weeks, but get your fundamentals right. Soil, hopefully not super high pH water. Same amount of soil. Timelines and consistent light. You don't need 4 lights per shelf unless you really want to see what your canopy looks like, and it might be amazing, but you can still only fit 4 trays and they can only get so bushy. So be curious to see if you did a micronutrient analysis of the crop, if any of the antioxidant levels were higher or any of the micronutrients were higher. The minerals are pulled from, usually from the seed and sometimes from the soil if they go on long enough, so possibly, but antioxidants are usually a defense mechanism, so they usually come from photosynthesis. Be curious to see what happened there. That's it for this one. I just wanted to encourage everyone to stay as simple as possible because there are enough things involved in growing that are super complex. And I do find this guy was a sound engineer, and I'm in tech. I'm a former IT engineer, so we like to try to automate and complicate things just because that's how we like to tinker. That's how our brain works. Growing things, I find if you start to apply that cold calculation to growing things, it kind of takes the joy out of it. If you're doing it for business, obviously you have to think about yield, but half the joy of farming and growing things is just watching life happen. It's still a magical process. From a single seed, this happens. Explain that. Being a little facetious, but the magic of life can't be understated and can't be overstated rather, and it's beautiful to just be around it. So if you're getting into an endeavor that is fostering the growth of life, make sure it still retains some of that majesty and you don't reduce it down to a cold calculation when you're just thinking about yield. Most people get into it not only for the self-sufficiency aspect, but because it's so cool and you're around a living, thriving ecosystem that you're helping to foster. So make sure it retains that majesty. Tinker all you want, but get your fundamentals down and then start experimenting once you've got some consistent cycles. And we'll see you next week with another Syncretist Society podcast. Take care.